Barely a century since the dawn of the age of the motor car, experts had already warned that man had used almost half of the world's oil reserves, oil it had taken nature millions of years to produce. In this series, we trace the history of the industry that brought us that oil and consider its future in an ever-changing world. This episode examines how in the 1970s, the member countries of OPEC, that had been created 10 years before, came to understand the value of oil as a fearsome weapon against the West. At that time, OPEC represented about 50% of world production, a fact that placed a great deal of pressure not only on the majors, whose hegemonic power had remained largely intact until then, but also on the industrial countries who increasingly depended on OPEC for oil. But the winds of protest didn't only blow from OPEC members with revolutionary ideas, like Algeria and Libya, but also from more conservative member states and one-time allies of the United States, like Saudi Arabia and Iran. They had a common objective: to better their oil income by increasing the price of a barrel. The price rocketed so regularly during the next 10 years that the members of OPEC believed that they had at last become the new masters of black gold. Once again, it was war that was to be at the heart of these times. On the afternoon of October the 6th, 1973, Egypt and Syria, backed by Jordan, launched an attack on Israel. Egyptian troops crossed the Suez Canal, and the Fourth Arab-Israeli War had begun. The attack came as a surprise to Israel, and all the more since it was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Egyptian forces advanced and pushed back the Israeli defense line that lay 15 kilometers beyond. Although a local war, what became known as the Yom Kippur War triggered the greatest upheaval in the history of oil. It started in 1967, when Arab nationalism was exacerbated by the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories following the Six-Day War. President Anwar el-Sadat, who succeeded Nasser, wished he could liberate them. He understood the battle had to be led on both the military and the economic field of war, using oil as a weapon. First, he gained the support of King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, a fierce enemy of Israel and the leader of the greatest oil power in the region. In 1972, King Faisal, on a visit to President Nixon, warned the US government to change their stance towards the Palestinian question or risk serious economic retaliation, and by this he meant oil. Arab nationalism was nurtured by the Palestinian cause and the OPEC members' claims. It happened in the shadow of a deep change in the international monetary system, which had been the exclusive domain of the dollar until then. The system had been established following an Allied meeting at Bretton Woods in the United States after World War II. At that time, the US had reached the height of its power, possessed 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, and the dollar became the currency for international trade. The US solemnly promised to guarantee the dollar with gold. But everything changed at the beginning of the 1960s. The number of dollar banknotes in issue outside the United States exceeded their value in American gold reserves and could no longer be guaranteed. And so in 1971, as the situation became critical, President Nixon broke America's promise and abandoned the system, allowing the dollar to float and be devalued. OPEC member countries were the first to suffer from the devaluation, as oil had always been traded in dollars. With such conditions, even the smallest of events could push OPEC into action.
The precipitating event to the rise of OPEC was certainly the October War in 1973, October of '73. It's a dangerous war for Israel. Israel appears for a moment to be on the verge of defeat. The United States in particular comes forward aggressively to supply Israel. In the heat of the war, the Arab nations reach for the one last weapon that they have to use, the so-called oil weapon, and they embargo shipments of oil to the nations supporting Israel, primarily the United States.
Only 10 days after the beginning of the Yom Kippur War, as Israeli troops began to recover with the backing of their U.S. protector, the oil weapon was on the move. On the 16th and 17th of October, in Kuwait City, the representatives of 6 members of OPEC, led by Sheikh Yamani, then oil minister of Saudi Arabia, and his Iranian counterpart, Abu Zegar, met at the Sheraton. In just a few hours, they unanimously agreed to raise the price of crude by 70%. The day after, Yamani upped the pressure by proposing a 5% monthly cut in oil production until Israeli troops left the occupied territories. After a busy week of diplomatic exchanges between Israel's US allies and OPEC's Soviet allies, a ceasefire was agreed to prevent the spread of the crisis to the whole region. It was signed on October the 22nd and 23rd by the UN Security Council, who also sent 7,000 UN peacekeepers into the region. The ceasefire strengthened OPEC's position, and its members agreed to a 25% cut in production and a total embargo on the export of oil to Israel and its friends.
We wanted only to attract the international public opinion to the fact that there is a problem between the Arabs and the Israelis.
In Tehran on December the 23rd, OPEC further agreed a 13% increase on the price of oil. In just 2 months, the price increased fourfold. The Shah of Iran declared, "The industrial nations will have to understand that the time of tremendous progress, benefits, and even more formidable wealth due to cheap oil has now come to an end." Between 1973 and 1974, the price of fuel rocketed and the oil supply became restricted. This was to be recognized as the first international oil crisis. For the West, it ultimately put an end to 30 years of wealth and the carefree use of abundant, cheap oil, which, at the time, seemed somehow inexhaustible. OPEC was, of course, accused of being responsible for this global situation, and for the first time it was labeled as a cartel, and an aggressive one at that. It was now capable of undermining the very foundations of the developed world.
Ça fait l'effet d'un véritable électrochoc sur l'opinion publique et sur le gouvernement. Mais la question se pose quand même que les pays arabes imposent un embargo pendant une guerre, à l'occasion d'une guerre avec Israël, dans laquelle certains pays soutenaient Israël. Bon, à la limite, bon, on le comprend, surtout qu'en Arabie Saoudite, il y avait un roi, le roi Faisal, très nationaliste, et qui tenait quand même à avoir une politique un peu d'indépendance de son pays sur un sujet crucial pour tout arabe et tout musulman. Mais comment se fait-il que cette organisation des pays exportateurs de pétrole soit restée plus de 12 ans avec un siège avant à Genève, ensuite à Vienne, quelques réunions, on discute royauté, comptabilité, comment on calcule l'impôt. Tout d'un coup, prend son courage à deux mains, et voilà, on quadruple les prix du pétrole, et qu'ils font ce qu'ils veulent, les pays industrialisés. Mais comment se fait-il un groupe de pays du tiers-monde, c'est-à-dire politiquement faible, militairement faible, économiquement faible, qui impose leur volonté aux puissants de ce monde, à des pays industrialisés, aux États-Unis, à l'Europe, au Japon? Qu'est-ce qu'il leur a pris? Évidemment, cette version des choses l'OPEP est devenu un cartel, tout le monde l'appelle cartel, le pétrole. Mais qu'est-ce qu'il arrive? Cette version des choses, c'est du cinéma. Du cinéma pur et simple. Parce que les choses ne sont pas comme ça, c'est comme ça. Jamais, jamais, au grand jamais, l'OPEP n'aurait quadruplé, n'aurait osé augmenter ça. Si les prix de ne serait-ce que les 10% n'ont pas des quadruplés, s'il n'y avait pas quelque chose derrière.
But the huge price increase was due in part to a threat that had been looming over the industry, and in particular the United States, since the end of the 1960s. It was at a time when President Nixon was being warned by his advisors that the US, whose fuel consumption continued to grow, had become dependent on Middle Eastern oil. Oil that was so cheap that it could prove fatal to the US oil industry, an industry that had become steadily less competitive as domestic reserves decreased.
Je crois que derrière le premier choc pétrolier, au-delà de ce qu'on cite toujours, la guerre du Kippour, octobre 1973, il y a des raisons fondamentales pour lesquelles un changement était nécessaire et une hausse forte des prix était presque inévitable. On était sur un rythme de croissance des productions et des consommations mondiales de pétrole au cours des 30 années précédentes, entre 6 et 7% par an, donc presque un doublement tous les 10 ans. Et ça n'était pas tenable sur le long terme. Il y a d'ailleurs des gens qui avaient déjà lancé un cri d'alarme, c'était le Club de Rome. Alors, ils avaient parlé du pétrole et d'autres choses, de la nourriture, de l'eau, d'un certain nombre de ressources minérales. Mais pour le pétrole, c'est évident que le rythme n'était pas soutenable et que pour casser ce rythme, quelque chose devait se produire. Et ce quelque chose, ça a été l'envolée des prix.
And so the majors faced not just a shift of power towards OPEC, but for the first time the real consideration that the oil may not last forever. Until the end of the 1960s, the majors had controlled the whole oil process, from the well to the petrol pump. They had applied the vertical integration model first employed by John D. Rockefeller a century earlier. Rockefeller was the brilliant founder of the first oil empire in 1870, Standard Oil. After the first oil crisis of 1973 to 1974, everything changed for the majors, who were compelled to make drastic reforms.
The majors proved incredibly adaptive, as they always have in their history, to the crisis of the 1970s. They quickly understood that the ground had shifted underneath their feet, and they went about the business of finding a new stance to take toward the producing nations and toward OPEC, capitalizing on their access to the most modern technology. They retained much of the business they had done in the past on different terms, as contractors as opposed to owners. This adaptation proved to be successful for the major oil companies, although it did make their business much more difficult to manage on a worldwide basis.
In fact, the crisis led to an almost complete reversal of the fortunes of the majors versus OPEC.
Pour simplifier tout ça en deux chiffres, à la veille du choc pétrolier, les sociétés pétrolières privées, enfin privées au public international, contrôlaient 80% des réserves et les sociétés nationales des pays producteurs 20%. 10 ans après, c'est les pourcentages inverses, qui sont toujours les pourcentages actuels, c'est-à-dire que les sociétés nationales des pays producteurs contrôlent 80% des réserves mondiales et les sociétés pétrolières internationales 20%.
Well, the oil companies, they were happy to withdraw from deciding the price of oil. They were as the buffer element between the producers and the consumers. And after the October War, and they felt that the heat is too much, they decided to withdraw. They even refused to negotiate with the oil producers about the price of oil. However, a high price of oil is very good for the oil companies. They make a real handsome profit. And this is what happened. And they use that huge profit in investments to explore and develop alternative sources of supply.
And the transfer of power between the majors and OPEC was to completely change the rules under which the industry operated.
Tant que c'était les mêmes groupes qui géraient l'amont et l'essentiel de l'aval, avec un système de prix relativement stable, le commerce se faisait sur la base de contrats essentiellement moyen-long terme, avec des prix qui étaient les prix officiels des sociétés. C'était la base des contrats. À partir du moment où l'OPEC a pris le contrôle, première conséquence, les sociétés ne contrôlant plus l'ensemble de la chaîne vont se mettre à avoir une bien moins bonne visibilité de leurs sources d'approvisionnement et donc s'approvisionner à beaucoup plus court terme.
Uncertainties, due to the disappearance of an acknowledged oil pricing system, favored the emergence of a free market where oil was exchanged on a day-to-day basis. The new market was controlled by traders and was characterized by considerable price fluctuations. In some instances, the price of a single cargo of oil, its owners, or even its destination were known to change several times during a single trip.
Βάφετε και ξαναβάφετε τους τοίχους μέχρι να φανεί ομοιόμορφο το χρώμα. Βάψτε με το Paint Wizard, χωρίς κόπο, με ένα πέρασμα και μόνο με ένα χέρι. Βάψτε με άνεση επιφάνειες όπως ταπετσαρίες, σοβάδες, πλαστικά ή ταβάνια. Το Paint Wizard είναι ένα ειδικά σχεδιασμένο ρολό βαφής που σας επιτρέπει να βάζετε την μπογιά στην ειδική εσοχή και να βάφετε τους τοίχους εύκολα και γρήγορα. Με το Paint Wizard βάφετε ομοιόμορφα προς όποια κατεύθυνση θέλετε. Μαζί θα πάρετε το δοχείο, μία σκάφη, αλλά 2 ρολά για εναλλαγές χρώματος, ένα ειδικό ρολό για τις γωνίες με 3 ανταλλακτικές κεφαλές και την τηλεσκοπική λαβή για να φτάνετε ψηλά. Για επαγγελματικά αποτελέσματα, Paint Wizard. Τηλεφωνήστε τώρα στο 210 2703 111 και αποκτήστε το Paint Wizard εύκολα και γρήγορα μόνο με 36 ευρώ και 90 λεπτά. Είναι μία προσφορά των Telemarketing Store.
Ήρθε το επαναστατικό τηγάνι με επικάλυψη πέτρας Kitchen Pro. Η επικάλυψη του Kitchen Pro είναι απόλυτα ανθεκτική στις χαραγματιές. Σας επιτρέπει να μαγειρεύετε τέλεια χωρίς επιπλέον λάδι ή βούτυρο. Είναι απόλυτα αντικολλητικό και ιδανικό για απλή και γρήγορη προετοιμασία φαγητού. Έχει βάση από αλουμίνιο και είναι κατάλληλο για χρήση σε γκάζι, ηλεκτρική ή αλοκεραμική κουζίνα και επαγωγική εστία. Διαθέτει εργονομική λαβή, επενδεδημένη με βακελίτη για να αντέχει. Διατίθεται σε διάμετρο 20, 24 και 28 εκατοστών. Τηλεφωνήστε τώρα στο 210 27 03 111 και αποκτήστε το τηγάνι με επικάλυψη πέτρας Kitchen Pro των 20 εκατοστών με 29 ευρώ και 90 λεπτά, των 24 εκατοστών με 39 ευρώ και 99 λεπτά και των 28 εκατοστών με 60 ευρώ. Αγοράζοντας τα 2 τηγάνια των 24 εκατοστών και των 28 εκατοστών θα σας κάνουμε δώρο το τηγάνι των 20 εκατοστών. Μία προσφορά Telemarketing Store.
The oil crisis fueled both a social and economic crisis throughout the industrialized world. Unemployment, bankruptcy, liquidation and stagflation were things that the richer countries had readily forgotten since the post-war years, but now they were back. However, the seeds of something positive were to grow from the situation too. For the first time, people were becoming aware of the threat of exhaustion of fossil fuels such as oil and gas, and starting to consider the environment. The governments of some European countries paid heed. France, this took the form of the chasse aux gaspilles, or hunting down wasters campaign.
En France, on n'a pas de pétrole, mais on a des idées.
Quand vous restez en deuxième ou en troisième à haut régime, voici ce qui se passe. En passant tout de suite en quatrième ou en cinquième, vous allez aussi vite, en consommant moins et sans fatiguer votre moteur. Passez en quatrième ou en cinquième et économisez du carburant.
Vous aussi, chassez le gaspille.
Ne jetez pas vos kilowattheures par les fenêtres. Moi Oui, au lieu de faire votre lessive pour 3 fois rien,
encore
remplissez votre appareil. Vous ferez des économies.
Et pourtant, c'est si simple d'économiser. Accélérer doucement, maintenir une vitesse constante, passer les vitesses en souplesse et éviter les freinages brutaux. Les économies d'énergie, pensez-y.
Additionally, the crisis was to stimulate research into greater efficiency within the industry.
The idea that price could be cut if more and better technology could be found to find and produce oil. Two of the results of this movement into greater investment in technology were 3D seismic and 4D seismic, new techniques using high-powered computers, which lets explorers literally see under the surface of the Earth and in a way that was never possible before, predict with much greater accuracy what they're going to find when they drill. The other is incredible advances in drilling technology, which allows companies to drill numerous holes from a single site, to drill essentially at a right angle deep into the earth, things that were not seen to be possible 30, 40 years ago, things that became possible in the 1970s and 1980s.
Ça a permis d'aller exploiter des pétroles plus chers. La mer du Nord n'aurait probablement pas pu être développée avec les anciens prix. On peut même dire que ça aurait été impossible. La même chose pour l'Alaska, donc ça a permis d'exploiter de nouvelles ressources. Ça a ouvert la porte à l'exploitation de ce qu'on appelait à l'époque les pétroles non conventionnels, les offshore profonds, les bruts ultra lourds. Et également, ça a permis de lancer des grands développements dans d'autres énergies, en particulier le nucléaire.
Until the 1960s, North Sea oil fields were not a financially viable option. They were difficult to exploit as they lay in deep waters with unfavorable weather conditions. However, the oil crisis was to allow the majors to invest considerable quantities of money into researching this area. The case of Frigg, a giant gas field between Norway and Scotland, was a notable example of what could be accomplished. Figures alone can best describe what was needed to make the gas field possible, with its artificial archipelago of 5 half-submarine platforms rising 30 meters above the sea. It took 3 years to build the equivalent of a town for 200,000 people. It cost the same as 10 modern nuclear plants. It required 450,000 tons of concrete and 50,000 tons of specialized steel, and it was believed to be 7 times heavier than the Eiffel Tower. Technical advancements in deep offshore drilling helped multiply North Sea production 5-fold between 1974 and 1978. This led to a decrease in Europe's dependency upon OPEC. The United States again turned its attention to exploration, but now in some of the more difficult regions, such as the northernmost part of Alaska. They had started prospecting this region after World War II to meet the demand of the US Navy. But although they had made promising discoveries, they gave up, as the weather conditions were simply too harsh. They resumed at the start of the 1970s, but the problem of transporting oil through a mountain region with extreme temperatures and frequent earthquakes was yet to be solved. The solution came in the shape of the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline, a gigantic 1,270-kilometer-long tube that ran across Alaska from the oil field of Prudhoe Bay in the north to the ice-free port of Valdez in the south. And, to add to their problems, the pipeline had to be positioned 3 meters above the ground so as not to disturb the yearly migration of Alaskan moose and caribou. The results speak for themselves. For the past 30 years, North Alaska has been the main U.S. oil region responsible for 25% of national production. Nevertheless, this success was scarcely enough to reduce the U.S. oil bill or to ease concerns about the longevity of oil. New research was carried out to reduce dependence on oil, a new search for renewable, non-polluting forms of energy. The first wind farms appeared. Solar power offered a new concept in domestic energy. But despite high hopes, these forms of energy remained largely experimental. But for nuclear energy, things were different. The race for nuclear power between the United States, Japan, and various European countries was led by France. And it remains the country with the greatest number of nuclear plants per capita today. On March the 6th, 1973, the French nuclear program was launched in a televised speech by President Pompidou's Prime Minister, Pierre Mesmer.
Mais notre grande chance, c'est l'énergie électrique d'origine nucléaire. Parce que nous avons une bonne expérience dans tout cela. Nous l'avons depuis la fin de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale et nous avons développé toutes les activités nucléaires, civiles et militaires depuis une douzaine d'années, comme vous le savez. Et puis aussi parce que maintenant, nous avons la volonté de le faire, car nous croyons que c'est cela la solution à nos besoins. Et nous avons pris aujourd'hui même une décision très importante. Nous avons pris la décision de réaliser en 1974 et 1975 le lancement de 13 centrales nucléaires de 1000 mégawatts chacune, qui coûtent environ 1 milliard de francs actuels chacune.
The speech was seen as a victory for nuclear energy, and its supporters were very influential people at the fore of the French electricity industry. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who succeeded Georges Pompidou as the French president, was the great deviser of this ambitious program. But hardly had it started when people from all over France demonstrated in a show of discontent and anger. The nuclear power plants had been built without the people's consent, and many of them feared the danger they represented. Anti-nuclear activists took to the streets, not just in France, but all over the world, and marked the beginning of today's environmental movement. However, their determination was not enough to stop the nuclear tide, and in the following years France created 19 new plants, sheltering 58 reactors, with a 62,000 megawatt capacity each. The problem of nuclear waste or possible nuclear disaster notwithstanding, the program was an indisputable achievement of technological advancement, allowing France to produce 70% of its own electricity. Five years later, the industry experienced a crisis on an unexpected scale. But the second oil crisis was not triggered by a war. This time it was triggered by a revolution, which was to shake Iran in the 1970s and 1980s. As in the time of Mossadegh, the man behind the nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1951, the Islamic Revolution against the Shah of Iran started with an oil workers' strike in October 1978. In just a few days, the strike paralyzed Abadan, one of the largest refineries in the world, spread throughout the Iranian oil sector, and inflamed the whole country. Ayatollah Khomeini, the Shah's fiercest opponent, who was in exile in a French village near Paris, solemnly called for resistance, declaring that to join the strike was to obey God's will. His call rang out across the country, and soon not a drop of oil was extracted in Iran, a country that produced 6 million barrels a day. The crisis occurred in the autumn, a season when oil companies traditionally stored stocks of oil as provisions for winter. And as Iran was OPEC's second largest exporter of oil after Saudi Arabia, a shortage was bound to occur. It wasn't immediately felt, though, as OPEC's remaining members tried to fill the gap. And still, prices rose as the market reacted to the hysteria in a somewhat irrational fashion.
It's not just an economic phenomenon, it's also a psychological one. It is a broad proclamation to consumers, to politicians, to producers in the developed world that they are no longer in control of their energy destiny. And this, I think, that psychological impact also has long-term inflationary pressures. It's the inflation built on fear, and you can certainly see that in 1978 and 79 with the Iranian Revolution and the price shock that comes then, the doubling of oil again. Part of that is a psychological response to the memory of 1973, where people are saying, here we go again, we no longer control our own energy source, how can we protect ourselves in the future? And that psychological impact bids up the price of oil dramatically in 1979 and 1980.
The unrest in Iran soon descended into sheer rebellion as the mullahs called the people to action. The Shah, who was ill and physically weakened, couldn't control the situation, especially since his American friends, exasperated by his growing megalomania, had abandoned him. Though he had been raised to the height of his power by oil after Mossadegh's fall, it was oil again that was to cause his ruin. On January the 16th, 1979, he was compelled to leave Iran forever and live out his years in exile. 1 week later, on January the 23rd, Tehran welcomed Ayatollah Khomeini as its new hero. His return from exile marked the beginning of the Iranian Islamic Revolution. The chaos that ensued only worsened the crisis further. Despite Saudi efforts to maintain supply by operating at capacity, a crisis could not be avoided. Between December 1978 and May 1979, the price of a barrel of oil increased by up to 175% in some countries. It was during this time that border disputes occurred between Iran and Iraq, in the region of Shatt al-Arab, a region that was very rich in oil. The Shah and Saddam Hussein had signed a non-aggression pact 5 years earlier in Algiers. It was intended to put an end to secular conflict over the position of the border. But times had changed. After the Shah's fall, Saddam Hussein no longer felt the need to respect the agreement. And he had the full political and economic support of Gulf countries, who were concerned by the rise of Iranian revolutionary Islam and happy to let Iraq do the dirty work. At that time, the West and the USSR also approved of the modern secular regime of Baghdad. They saw Iraq as a possible shield against Shiite Islamism and gave Saddam free rein. Saddam Hussein invaded Iran in September 1980. He told his troops it would be a walkover, but it lasted 8 years, with its fair share of atrocities on both sides. Fanatical child soldiers used as human shields, gassed innocent civilians, hundreds of thousands dead or wounded. Oil soon became a major strategic stake in the war between these prosperous oil-producing countries. On both sides, oil fields became a major target for land, air, and sea attacks. The mass destruction that followed kept oil markets in fear of shortage and speculation increased. The situation continued until the middle of the 1980s, more than 10 years after the first oil crisis. Whilst slowing down the West's economic growth, the crisis had a far greater effect on the Third World, in the countries that didn't produce oil. The increase in their energy bill, which sometimes represented 90% of their imports, had dramatic economic and social consequences and doomed them to stagnation. After the hope of the 1960s, the 1970s opened up a long period of excessive debts, political unsteadiness, and mass migration, mainly caused by the oil crisis. But for the OPEC countries, the price explosion had a completely opposite effect. Their economies were flooded by a downpour of petrodollars, a new word coined after the first oil crisis.
The issue of petrodollars is an interesting one because the time that became a very prominent term was in the 70s when the price of oil suddenly went up tenfold. And for a brief period of time, most of the OPEC countries were literally rolling in money. The numbers in Saudi Arabia, for instance, of what their per capita income was like when the 70s started and what the per capita income was like by the time oil prices peaked in the early 80s is just astonishing.
During that period, the OPEC trade surplus totaled $700 billion. But what would they do with so much money?
La question des effets d'un enrichissement brutal des pays producteurs est une question controversée et qui est assez difficile parce que souvent on entend des choses très extrêmes en disant cet argent a été complètement gâché dans les pays producteurs, ils n'en ont rien fait, ils ont fait des palais, ils ont acheté des armes aux pays occidentaux. Je crois que les choses sont quand même plus compliquées. D'abord, quand on visite ces pays, on voit qu'ils se sont considérablement transformés. Et pour beaucoup d'entre eux, il y a un développement, les villes n'ont rien à voir avec ce qu'elles étaient il y a 40 ans. L'éducation, le système éducatif s'est considérablement développé. C'est vrai dans les Émirats, à Koweït, à Qatar, en Arabie même. Les pays ont été considérablement transformés. Donc de dire que rien n'a été fait, ça me paraît une méconnaissance complète du terrain. Il est vrai également qu'il y a eu de l'argent mal employé, des dépenses militaires parfois extravagantes, ou des dépenses somptuaires. Je crois que là, vous savez, les États, c'est pas très différent des individus. Quelqu'un qui s'enrichit brutalement, en général, il fait pas un usage très modéré et très raisonnable de son argent. Donc l'enrichissement rapide conduit à faire un certain nombre d'excès.
Nevertheless, some OPEC members try to use their petrodollars as a means for development. That was the case in Algeria, which was still fueled by its revolutionary desire.
C'est incontestablement une chance pour un pays que de disposer de richesses naturelles, y compris quand c'est des hydrocarbures. Aujourd'hui, j'ai même envie de dire que c'est une chance pour un pays de pouvoir disposer d'importantes réserves de pétrole et de gaz. Alors, ces richesses, lorsqu'elles sont bien exploitées, peuvent générer des revenus substantiels qui, lorsqu'ils sont bien utilisés, peuvent permettre de faciliter la tâche aux dirigeants d'un pays pour développer, pour moderniser son économie. Alors la tâche était dure dans un pays comme l'Algérie, et pas uniquement dans un pays comme l'Algérie, dans d'autres pays de l'OPEP. La tâche était dure parce qu'on partait de très très loin. Les structures sociales, les structures économiques n'étaient pas peut-être prêtes à absorber des revenus aussi importants d'une manière centralisée. Il se peut que le problème était génétique au départ.
Despite this, some sectors like health and education in both Algeria and Iraq achieved spectacular development thanks to oil money. But other projects that were too ambitious or irrelevant simply failed. The temptation of heavy industry is a good example of such failure, and Algeria experienced it bitterly. Badly advised by the Soviets, they launched into an extensive industrial program to compete with the Western countries on their own terms. It was a total failure. But however different they were, all OPEC members were to experience the same kind of failures. And they were the symptoms of a common disease, underdevelopment.
Le sous-développement, ce n'est pas seulement un revenu par tête d'habitant plus faible qu'ailleurs, c'est une mentalité, c'est une composition sociale, intellectuelle, un niveau éducatif, une maîtrise des mécanismes de l'économie, de la croissance, c'est un tout. Et un pays sous-développé est bien entendu moins bien armé qu'un pays développé pour maîtriser des événements majeurs qui bouleversent son destin. Et on le voit très clairement dans la manière dont la manne pétrolière a été gérée par un pays comme la Norvège, pays développé, et par des pays de l'OPEP qui font partie de la zone sous-développée. La Norvège n'a jamais sombré dans les problèmes que les pays de l'OPEP ont connus, car elle a su tout de suite, et c'est la deuxième raison, geler, pratiquement mettre dans un frigo une partie des flux pétroliers, des revenus pétroliers, pour ne pas déstabiliser son économie. Car ce deuxième facteur est très important. Lorsque dans n'importe quelle économie, qu'il s'agisse dans ce cas d'une économie développée ou d'une économie sous-développée, lorsqu'il y a un facteur déstabilisant qui intervient, soudainement, eh bien, si on n'est pas capable de créer une séparation entre ce facteur et le reste de l'économie, on en subit immédiatement et de manière inéluctable les conséquences. Le troisième facteur, c'est un facteur propre à toute rente, qu'elle soit pétrolière ou autre. Une rente, c'est par définition l'assurance d'une source de revenus parfois permanente, durable et importante. Cela veut dire que dans l'esprit des acteurs dans un pays donné, c'est la voie ouverte à la facilité. C'est pas grave si ça va mal, la rente, qu'elle soit pétrolière ou autre, va nous aider à nous en sortir.
In Nigeria, the sixth largest oil exporter in the world, such income had catastrophic consequences. This country is one of the most populated on the African continent, and it is also one of the richest in hydrocarbon. When oil money started to pour in, people stopped growing cocoa and groundnut, which had provided the country's main income since colonial times. In just a few years, much of Nigeria's agricultural land stood idle, and mass migration was occurring. Venezuela suffered the same tragedy when production of coffee collapsed. The consequences were the same as in Nigeria, a mass exodus from the countryside to towns, turning them into powder kegs. For the Gulf monarchies, the situation was different. New towns sprang out of the desert to the benefit of Western companies. They were the most striking examples of the dramatic effect black gold could have in just a few decades in these underpopulated desert countries. In the 1970s, the people greatly benefited from oil wealth, a useful tool to ensure social peace, even though it gave them a less entrepreneurial spirit. A few Western executives and a great number of Arab and Asian immigrants coming from poor, overpopulated countries ensured the smooth running of all public and private sector activities. As for the ruling families, they took advantage of the years of plenty to become personally richer by investing a substantial part of their country's oil income on the international financial market, and their own wealth grew at the expense of the nation. In the Gulf countries, as in many OPEC countries, there was little room for democracy or the modernization of society, which had marked the 1970s and 1980s.
I talked with King Fahd just before I left, in the last meeting that I had with him as ambassador. And he talked about, basically about the use of their wealth. When I said, look, you didn't put the oil under your ground. God did. He believed in God. And I knew that he would accept that. In any case, the Arabs had nothing to do with putting the oil there. And you didn't exploit it either. The Americans exploited it. And you have been given extraordinary wealth. And you have squandered this. Most of it has been wasted. If you use this money wisely, you'll be blessed for 1,000 years. You can transform not only Saudi Arabia, not only the Arab world, but you can transform all of Dar al-Islam, I said. And I said, if you waste this money, your descendants are going to dig up your bones and burn them. Everybody in the world wants to find oil because they think how wonderful this will be, what a great blessing it will be for us, but oil is a curse.
In the late 1970s, a period of outrageous oil wealth, the euphoric members of OPEC hadn't yet realized that the downpour of petrodollars would soon run dry and turn into a curse. At the beginning of the 1980s, while the OPEC producers' power was still rising, the world's consumption of oil was decreasing, largely as a result of increasing use of nuclear power for electricity, and in part due to an increase in the philosophy of saving energy. Fueled too by overproduction of oil in 1982, the odds turned in favor of the consuming countries. All the factors for a third oil crisis, or rather a counter-crisis, were in place. In March 1982, OPEC tried to stop the crisis by limiting production through quotas. But the financial needs of OPEC member states continued to increase, and they failed to respect the quotas they had themselves agreed on. Member countries resorted to wild competition between themselves in the hope of conquering the market. The very existence of the organization was threatened, with only Saudi Arabia continuing to play ball.